The coffin's empty, someone screamed just as the first shovel of dirt hit the grave. My father lunged at the funeral workers, screaming for them to close it, while 200 people stood frozen in the rain, people who thought they were burying me. I was 27 years old, standing 10 feet behind my own funeral, watching strangers cry over a framed photo of my face, while my dad collected donation envelopes like condolences. $82,000. That's how much my death was worth to him. Nobody knew I was alive. Not the pastor. Not my cousins. Not the women hugging my father while he pretended to shake with grief. Then the funeral director pulled a folded document out of the coffin and looked directly at my dad. His expression changed instantly. And that's when I realized the empty coffin wasn't the worst thing he was hiding. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rain hammered against the black umbrellas packed around the grave as people started backing away from the coffin. Nobody understood what they were looking at yet. They just knew something was wrong. My father's face had completely changed. 5 minutes earlier, he'd been performing grief perfectly. Head lowered, voice shaking, accepting hugs while people whispered about what a tragedy it was to lose a daughter so young. Now he looked trapped. "Give me that," he snapped at the funeral director, reaching for the paper. The director stepped back instead. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked loudly enough for nearby mourners to hear. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't how I planned it. I came there to expose my father for faking my death and stealing donation money. I thought the empty coffin alone would destroy him. But the look on his face told me there was another layer to this scam, something even he was terrified of people discovering. A woman beside me started crying harder. She was holding a printed copy of my memorial photo against her chest like she'd actually known me. I'd never seen her before in my life. That was the sickest part. Most of these people were honest. Church members. Old neighbors. Former classmates. They brought flowers, food, sympathy cards, money. One elderly couple had donated $5,000 because my father told them he couldn't afford to bury his little girl. Meanwhile, 6 days earlier, I'd been sitting alive in a motel 40 miles away, watching him live stream fake grief on social media. I still remember the exact moment I realized he was really doing this. He looked directly into the camera beside my framed photo and said, "Nobody should ever have to bury their child." Then he started crying. Not one tear came out. Back at the cemetery, the crowd suddenly shifted toward the coffin again. One of the funeral workers slowly pulled the lid open wider. My father shoved forward so aggressively that 2 men had to grab his arms. "Don't touch that," he yelled. The entire cemetery went silent. And then a sharp chemical smell drifted out of the coffin. The funeral director looked down inside and went pale. The funeral director staggered back from the coffin like he'd touched something dangerous. "What the hell is that smell?" somebody whispered behind me. Rainwater slid down the back of my neck as the crowd pressed closer, trying to see inside. My father kept struggling against the 2 men holding him, his voice cracking now. "Close it," he barked. "Right now." But nobody listened to him anymore. That should have felt satisfying. Instead, I could barely breathe. Because standing there watching him panic dragged me straight back to 3 weeks earlier, before the fake funeral, before the live streams, before strangers started mourning me online. Back when I still thought my father was only lying about small things. It started with a message from my Aunt Celia at 2 in the morning. "How bad is your condition? Why didn't you tell us?" I stared at the text half asleep, completely confused. Then more messages came in. "We're praying for you. Your dad says the treatments aren't working. Is there anything you need?" At first, I honestly thought he'd mix me up with somebody else. But the next morning I drove straight to his apartment. The place smelled like cigarettes and stale beer. Unopened bills covered the kitchen counter beside racing slips and overdue notices stamped final warning in red ink. My father, Dorian Vale, stood there pretending nothing was wrong. "You told people I'm sick?" I asked. He barely looked up from his coffee. "People worry. That's what families do. You said I was dying. I said you weren't doing well. I remember laughing once because the lie sounded so ridiculous coming out loud. But then he leaned against the counter and gave me this irritated look, like I was the problem. "You've always been dramatic, Mariana." That sentence stuck with me because he said it so calmly, like using his daughter for sympathy was normal. I left after 10 minutes. I should have cut him off completely right then. Instead, 2 days later, my phone exploded with calls asking if I survived a boating accident. I didn't even own a boat. And when I opened Facebook, my father was live streaming beside my photo saying through fake tears, "She's gone." Then he looked into the camera and added, "The coffin stays closed. Nobody sees her." And suddenly, back in the cemetery, I realized exactly why he'd been so desperate about that coffin. Because whatever was inside it was never supposed to be seen. And the funeral director had just reached deeper into it with both hands. The funeral director pulled something heavy out from beneath the white satin lining, then stopped abruptly like he regretted touching it. People started murmuring all around the grave. My father's breathing turned ragged. "Put it back," he said quietly this time. "Please." That word hit harder than the yelling. Because Dorian Vale never begged unless he was cornered. I stayed hidden near the last row of umbrellas, watching everything unravel while my heart slammed against my ribs. Part of me wanted to walk straight up to him right there and end it. But another part needed to know how far he'd actually gone. The answer started 3 days earlier when I met a man named Selric at a diner off Route 8. Selric used to work with my father years ago doing warehouse inventory. He looked nervous the entire conversation, constantly checking the windows like he didn't want to be seen talking to me. When I told him I was alive, he nearly dropped his coffee. "I knew something was wrong," he muttered. "But not this wrong." He explained that my father owed over $60,000 to private lenders from gambling debts and failed sports bets. Not banks. Real people. The kind who showed up in person when payments stopped. He was desperate, Selric told me. Started asking weird questions about death certificates, emergency fundraising, how long paperwork takes to process. At first I thought the scam was only about donations. Then Selric leaned closer across the table. He kept saying the coffin couldn't be opened. "Because it's empty?" I asked. Selric shook his head immediately. "No. If it were empty, he wouldn't be this scared." Back at the cemetery, the pastor stepped toward my father with confusion written all over his face. "Dorian," he said carefully, "what exactly is inside that coffin?" The crowd went completely still. A funeral worker lifted the lid another few inches. That chemical odor grew stronger instantly. "There's something wrapped in plastic in there." My father stopped fighting the men holding him. He just stared at the coffin like his entire life was collapsing in front of him. The crowd surged forward despite the rain. Phones were already coming out. People whispered my name over and over, confused, scared, trying to understand why a funeral suddenly felt like a crime scene. Then I stepped out from behind the umbrellas. At first, only a few people noticed me. One woman gasped so sharply she dropped her flowers into the mud. Another person turned, saw my face, and froze completely. And within seconds, the panic spread through the cemetery. "That's her." "Oh my God. Mariana." My father looked up. The second he saw me alive, every bit of color drained from his face. Nobody moved. Not the pastor. Not the funeral workers. Not even the police officers standing near the cemetery entrance directing traffic. It felt like the entire world paused at once. I walked slowly toward the grave, my shoes sinking into wet grass. "You told them I was dead," I said. My voice shook more than I wanted it to. "You buried me for money." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The pastor looked between us in complete disbelief. "Dorian, what is happening?" Before he could answer, one of the officers approached the coffin and pulled the lid fully open. Inside weren't human remains. There were construction sandbags. Stacks of bricks wrapped tightly in plastic. Bundles packed carefully beneath layers of white funeral fabric to imitate the weight and shape of a body. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But then the officer reached deeper under the bags and pulled out something else. Documents. Dozens of them. Some were folded inside waterproof sleeves. Others were stuffed into plain envelopes held together with rubber bands. The funeral director took one look and stepped backward. "These are legal forms," he said quietly. Another officer unfolded a paper and read the top line out loud. "Certificate of death." My name was printed across it. I felt my stomach drop. Not because he lied to people online. Not because he stole donations. He had legally declared me dead. The officer slowly lifted his eyes toward my father. "You forged state documents?" he asked. And that's when my father finally spoke. "You don't understand," he said. "They were going to kill me." Rainwater dripped from the edge of the open coffin while the entire cemetery stared at my father. Nobody looked at him with sympathy anymore. Only shock. One of the police officers carefully sorted through the soaked paperwork spread across the funeral table beside the grave. There were forged marina reports, fake witness statements, copied signatures, and withdrawal receipts tied to the fundraiser accounts. My father had planned everything. The boating accident never happened. There was no missing person search because he filed documents claiming my body had already been recovered offshore and identified privately through personal belongings. He used a forged signature from a marina employee to make the report look official, then rushed the funeral before anyone could ask questions. And the closed coffin? That was supposed to solve the last problem. No body. No questions. Just grief. And money. The officer holding my fake death certificate looked disgusted. "You filed this with the state 4 days ago," he said. "You legally declared your daughter deceased." My father rubbed both hands over his face like he was finally too exhausted to keep pretending. "You don't know what those people would have done to me," he muttered. "What people?" I asked. He looked straight at me for the first time since I stepped forward. "The lenders." His voice cracked. Not from guilt. From fear. Everything came out after that. The gambling debts. The private loans. The threats. The collectors showing up outside his apartment. Selrick had been right. My father thought if he collected enough sympathy money fast enough, he could disappear before the people he owed caught up with him. And apparently $82,000 was the number he thought could save him. Around us, mourners reacted in waves. Some looked furious. Others looked humiliated. An older woman started crying after realizing she had emptied part of her retirement savings into the fundraiser because my father told her he couldn't afford to bury his daughter properly. A man near the back shouted, "You used all of us." Phones kept recording everything. Nobody was leaving. 2 officers finally grabbed my father's wrists and turned him toward the patrol car waiting near the cemetery gates. He didn't resist this time. As they walked him away, he looked back at me. "Mariana." I cut him off before he could finish. "You buried me long before today." He lowered his eyes after that. By that night, videos from the cemetery were everywhere online. Woman appears alive at her own funeral. Reporters uncovered additional scams connected to my father within days, fake medical fundraisers, fabricated emergencies, borrowed money tied to invented tragedies. The church cooperated with investigators immediately, and several donors filed lawsuits to recover what they'd given. The funeral home released statements explaining that my father repeatedly demanded the coffin stay sealed no matter what. 3 weeks later, the state officially reversed my death status. It felt surreal signing paperwork proving I existed. I moved into a small apartment across town after everything settled. Quiet place. No family photos. No live streams. No pretending. One afternoon, I visited my mother's grave alone. No cameras. No crowd. No fake tears. Just silence and rain tapping softly against the grass. And standing there, I realized something strange. My father never actually wanted a daughter. He wanted a story people would pay for. But the moment that coffin opened, the story stopped belonging to him.